Hello, and welcome to the Flights of Fancy podcast, where we talk about combat aviation and military aircraft, past, present, and future. Today's episode is going to be covering the Kyushu Q1W Tokai, or, if sources are to be believed, the world's first dedicated anti submarine aircraft. Now, there's a couple things I'd like to get off my chest. Since this is the first entry that we're talking about a Japanese aircraft, and specifically Japan in World War II. Much to the same degree as any conversation that will occur with regards to Germany in World War II, um, there is in no way, shape, or form that we are glorifying the companies or the actions portrayed by the two countries specifically during that conflict. Um, I guess the simplest way I can really put it is that Nazi scum can fuck off. This podcast ain't for you. All right, I had to redo this like three times because I couldn't. Anyways, so now that that's out of the way, let's get into Watanabe Engineering Corporation, otherwise known as Watanabe Ironworks or the Kyushu Aircraft Corporation Limited, and a few other names. Now, Watanabe is actually a company that still exists today, founded in 1886. It had kind of a storied history with the Japanese military complex, I guess we'll put it. Um, the important things to note for this episode are that here we've got a nice little satellite image of the main production, I believe, at least certainly where the company is still has their HQ in. And in this next slide, we have what is perceived as their main aircraft plant at Zasho Noguma in Fukuoka, Japan, on the island of Kyushu. In this little slide here, we can see that there's one area that is marked on the map. And from all intents and purposes, I can only imagine that that is where the manufacturing plant was once located. Um, we can also see a fairly distinctive uh, topographical feature here, this nice little river or canal that just kind of cuts into the island itself. If we look at this satellite image, we can see there's just the faintest little outline of this canal that still goes. And if you compare the two images, the factory would have been just about here-ish. It's hard to tell exactly just because I've got different aspects from this satellite image and this one taken in 1945. However, for the purposes of this, just to kind of give you an idea as to where this is and how things have kind of changed in 80 years. Another thing to point out is that Fukuoka Airport is actually I want to say, important airport for the island. We can see in this older slide, it took a little bit less space, but it also had a different nature to it in the sense that this airfield didn't actually exist much earlier. From what I can tell, it was created between 1942 and 1944. It still looks like a pretty rough construction here, and we can see that it's uh, on top of rice paddies or rice fields, which actually kind of was detrimental to it because, well, rice fields tend to flood or are built for flooding, which isn't exactly great aircraft terrain. Now, I should point out that manufacturing in Japan during World War II was never quite up to par in the sense that a nation like the United States could vastly, easily outproduce Japan. And this was true for Russia, and I believe even Britain outnumbered Japanese production. Um, So bad was the uh, influence of strategic bombing by the United States Air Force, and I guess the Navy as well, that production, or at least assembly, was moved to a lot of nearby mountains if they were found. In this instance, Watanabe was actually somewhat well placed in that having the mountains nearby, as well as your local airfield also being nearby, just meant a kind of more efficient way to produce aircraft. But um, I guess that's not technically here nor there. The company itself originated as the Watanabe Tokichi Honten. Um, they they were typically known as the Watanabe Ironworks in English parlance, and um, was at some point split between the manufacturing side, which typically would just produce parts or other steel items or iron items, and Kyushu Hikoki, which was more specifically the actual aeronautical division. Um, this split was somewhere in 1943. Um, Watanabe's own website names itself as the Kyushu Weapons Corporation and the Kyushu Airplane Corporation. So, kind of gives you an idea of what exactly this split was. In addition to that, Kyushu itself um, had a very limited production in the sense that they didn't really produce a lot of different designs. They produced an all right amount of aircraft, um, but they typically only had about six original designs. Although sadly, I can't find any sort of information on the sixth one itself, which seems to be lost to the ether. Now, the aircraft itself, or the company itself, being named Kyushu, obviously just because of its location on the island of Kyushu, had uh, the main factory being here Zashinaguma. But three more plants were added in 1945, but their production didn't actually, or construction for the factories didn't actually begin until 1944. So tooling was always going to be at an early stage, which affected total output, of course. Now, from the early days of producing aircraft, of which the Watanabe Corporation did so even beginning in the 1920s, uh, it's it was typical for the company to only produce or focus mainly on trainer aircraft. Um, they did have a couple of indigenous designs for fighters or seaplane designs, as well as having or building fighters on license production. Here we can see two of their original designs. The above one, the Watanabe E9W, is actually one of their seaplanes, obviously denoted by the floats, but this being more of a reconnaissance aircraft than anything else, and the Kyushu K11W being specifically a trainer aircraft. Now, development of the Q1W Tokai, or commonly known in Japan as the Eastern Sea, began in 1942. Um, the Imperial Japanese Navy issued a specification, 17 Shi, which called for a three-seat aircraft emphasizing endurance and having a comparatively low speed. It was also to be capable of attacking from a fairly steep dive and should be capable of safely operating over the ocean. Now, as far as I understand it, the specifications issued by the IJN or IJA follow the same sort of nature as British specifications in the sense that the governing body sends out a memo that says, hey, we're looking for an aircraft that fits A, B, and C. and we would like it by, earliest date possible, or whatever other specification they mention. And the same applies for Japan. So this specification would have been sent out. Several companies put in prototypes or designs for the request, and eventually only one came to fruition. This being obviously the one that we see, designed by engineer Nojiri. Sadly, I can't find any information on Mr. Nojiri, but he decided that a twin engine design would allow for better visibility out of the cockpit and also easier communication from the crew, rather than having the cockpit split in two, or say having a rear gunner that's way further down the frame, and so on and so forth. It was also just better in terms of you can have more fuel. You're generally designing for larger aircraft, so larger fuel tanks and so on, as well as just um, better. Uh, I mean, the visibility portion comes into play. So having a multi crew means you have more people looking out and about, and if you have other tech like radar, you can have a crew member dedicated solely to that. Now, the engines being used were twin Hitachi GK2C Amakaze 31s. Basically, these are 9-cylinder radial engines. And you can kind of see that in how the engine nacelle is designed, especially compared to inline engines. Now, the Q1W was supposed to use a new type of search radar. However, the delays in production meant that it had to carry a larger Type 3 radar, supplemented by a quote unquote magnetic anomaly detection gear. Now, sadly, I don't know if that is just a generic description for something that would accomplish that task, or if Japan had a dedicated item to for that purpose and it just didn't have a name for it, or a designation by the military. Now, the plane was also supposed to carry a 7.7 millimeter machine gun in the dorsal position, as well as bomb racks for two 250 kilogram depth charges. Additionally, it's mentioned that the aircraft could have one or two 20 millimeter cannons installed in the nose for offensive purposes. Now, one source mentions that instead of the guns firing straight forward, that these would be mounted to shoot downwards at an oblique angle. However, I can't really find anything that supports that mention, and I don't have any photos that would ever that support that either. The Q1W unfortunately was only produced in small numbers, so you don't really get to see. There's just certain details that were never captured on film. Now, something to also make note of is that this plane kind of gets confused, or if not confused, is insinuated that it has some sort of origin within the German military. However, this isn't exactly true. While there are similarities between these two aircraft, this being the Q1W and this being a Junkers Ju-88. Now, like I mentioned, the two are similar. We can see some of the similarities just in these two photos, namely that the engines kind of look the same. They're positioned in different ways on the wing. For example, um, the engines on the Q1W are mounted much lower, whereas the Ju-88 are higher. Um, the the spinners are different, of course, but that's a smaller detail. The other thing to keep in mind is just the nose, which is where most people think the influence comes from. But the Q1W has cuts down further back into the chin of the aircraft, so to speak, whereas the Ju-88 is a more straight approach on the nose. As well, just the cockpit design overall, how it arches, and what the front looks like is just a little too different from the JU-88 to really be confused between the two. Now, it does lead into certain discussions, which is just how much information did the Germans and Japanese exchange between the two countries, as they were nominally allied, but not really having the same purposes, other than I guess to be the best race in the world. Both losers, of course. Um, there was a sharing of technology. However, nothing ever really came about it. Um, the most influence that can probably be attributed to a Japanese design or having the influences of German technology would probably be the Ki-61, which we'll see in a later episode. But it should be pointed out that Japan did manage to acquire a Bf 109 and a Focke-Wulf 190 and tested both out. However, nothing ever seems to have come about um, those tests. And the Ju-88 never made it over to Japan. Um, Maybe some design papers, but even that's flimsy, and I wouldn't ever really rely on that as an argument. Very little information was ever passed on just because that information couldn't really readily be exchanged. Um, the distance between Germany and Japan is obviously rather large, and you don't really have an easy way to get from one country to the next. Just because, well, if you're flying, you've got Eastern Europe, Middle East, and pretty much the rest of Asia to deal with. Um, and by boat, you don't really have access to the Mediterranean after a certain point. The Indian Ocean is always being patrolled, and the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans are always a danger, to be sure. So the influence that they might have had is little, if any. Um, and that's why, yeah, the Ju-88 didn't really have an influence on this. Now, speaking of the Q1W Tokai, here we can see in this image that this aircraft is missing a propeller. This is specifically done to prevent it from being flown. This would be a photo that would be taken in 1945, just after the surrender of Japan, where the requirement was for all aircraft to have one propeller removed. Even if they were single engine aircraft, they'd have to have the propeller removed just so that they couldn't be flown and used for some sort of last ditch attack or whatnot. This also means that certain aircraft are more commonly seen in captured regalia rather than their actual colors. Just because so few images exist in, I guess we'll call it the Western world, because they either never made the transition from books and sources, or there just really aren't that many photos out there from that were ever taken by the local population or the Japanese forces. So, with regards to the aircraft, like I said, development started in 1942. The first aircraft was completed in September 1943 and, quote unquote, easily met all of the Navy's requirements and was noted to have pleasant handling characteristics. Mass production was authorized by the spring or for the spring of 1944. Um, to be designated the Navy Patrol Plane Tokai Model 11 by the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Force, although only 153 aircraft were ever produced slash rolled off of production lines by the end of the war. Now, these aircraft were operated from Japan, Formosa, and China, and basically their entire purpose was to protect shipping from the various constant Allied submarine attacks. Um, the loss of Japanese air superiority over the years meant that the Q1W was increasingly at risk of being easy prey to Allied fighters. Um, the Tokai was designed to be slow And, well, as soon as you find yourself in any sort of trouble, you don't really have any means to get out of it. Additionally, as mentioned before, the 7.7 millimeter machine gun, well, we've already had several talks about how rifle caliber munitions in 1945 doesn't quite have the same punch as it might have had 6 years prior, and it's just not enough to really defend itself with. Of the 140, or sorry, of the 153 aircraft produced, the first model was the Q1W1, which is basically just seen as the single prototype before um, mass production ever occurred. There is a contentious number to it. I've seen some, at least one source that I believe mentioned 1 to 3 prototypes. But the first main model would be the Q1W1 Model 11. It had the same features as the prototype. It's really just an extension of going from testing to production. Sadly, no exact numbers exist for how many were produced of each type. Of the 153, we can assume safely that at least one is a prototype, um, and the majority of the production would have gone to the first model. Again, not having any exact numbers, it's likely to be over 100 and more likely to be over 120 examples total. The reason I say this is because the second version, the Q1W2, was basically just a modified W1 to have wooden tail surfaces. And this was done in order to cut down on metal usage as Japan was constantly feeling the strain of the various blockading effects of both the Allied um, bombing campaigns as well as just the submarine effort in and around its home waters. Um, the W2 was built in small numbers, and no official number is mentioned anywhere as far as I can tell, which is why I assume that it's likely to be over 120 examples for the Q1W1. But again, it's probably just conjecture from myself. The last type that would ever be built was an all wooden model, named the Q1W1-K for Tokai Ren, and was basically just used as a trainer, being able to carry an extra crew member for 4 total to carry out those duties. But it seems that only one prototype was ever built. So, depending on how you want to look at the numbers specifically, it's either 151 non prototypes, maybe 149 non prototypes, with the rest being split more towards the Model 11 and the rest being W2s. To get back to this page, however, we can see that this is the, below here we have the Type 3 KU6 or KU6 Model 4 radar. This would have been the model of radar that the Q1W would have used at the time. Now, this specific radar was developed in 1942 and put in production in 1943. Testing showed that at an altitude above 3,000, the only source I can find for this does not mention feet or meters. I'm going to assume meters because feet 3,000 is very, very low. Anyways, above 3,000 meters, the system would discharge electricity, I believe known as the corona effect, which is not the same as the current effects of the coronavirus on the world. Anyways, the discharge occurred because the 10,000 volt power supply system would become affected by the decrease in humidity and the loss of atmospheric pressure as you go higher. Now, a subsequent variant would reduce its power supply, I believe, to 7,000 volts instead, in order to restrict the discharge problem. But yeah, probably not a fun time for the crewman that has to operate that set. The sets were typically big and heavy, which restricted their use to only the largest of aircraft. such as the H8K, the Kawanishi H8K, or the Mitsubishi G4M. Um, Only dedicated patrol aircraft were ever authorized for the sets. So you wouldn't necessarily see these on smaller aircraft like the B5N, so on. Additionally, the set was so heavy that in at least one source notes that when in use in these various aircraft, if they were bomber aircraft or torpedo bomber, I should say, they wouldn't actually be able to carry a torpedo, which very much limits their usefulness. If you have, say, a flight of 4 aircraft, you have one torpedo less because that aircraft is dedicated only to searching for targets. Now, the Japanese typically favored one common type of assembly for its radar installation, but did switch over to a second type, which was very similar to this one, and a third type, which would be more common with what you see with American aircraft. Namely, being that when these sets were first come out, um, you would see the installation on the rear of the fuselage near the tail. This was almost exclusively done, mainly because the Japanese didn't really have an understanding or appreciation of Yagi antenna at the time that this was implemented, and because they, well, they didn't enjoy the loss of speed, however little it may have actually affected the aircraft, and so they preferred to have installations down at the back. Now, the problem with an installation on the G4M that would only have these rear fuselage attachments was that because of its position, it can't actually see or track anything in front of it, which obviously becomes a problem because now your aircraft can only really search at an oblique angle or laterally. This was remedied by having an extra attachment at the front. And this, I believe this is a P1Y. This would be in the nose, but you have, we'll see with a couple other photos that sometimes the setups were different. Later on in the war, the Japanese crews became more comfortable with radar being an implementation in terms of searching and radar procedures and so on. That they would eventually get Yagi antenna, but never um, never really at the same rate as a U.S. aircraft. Now here we can kind of see what I'm talking about with a different setup. We can just barely make out the antenna on the side of the frame at the rear, but we can also see at the front there is this nice little pole that is we you can't see the horizontal blades, but basically this is the front part of the antenna to search forward. Additionally, we can see where exactly the crew would be seated. Your radar operator at the back is lower set, and presumably there would be a machine gun poking out here. Although I've never been able to find a photo with the rear gunner on. Similarly, here in this lesser, lower res photo, we can see the basically the front antenna. You can just barely make out some of the pixels for the horizontal blades, but it's about it, unfortunately. We can also get a nice view of, well, one of the nice little camouflaged hangar that they have, along with the blast protection that they have over here for any bombs and such. But we can get a nice little appreciation for the flaps. Um, this would be in reference to the steep angle of attack that these aircraft needed to be able to achieve, and these flaps would act as pseudo dive brakes. They're not specifically dive brakes, but the way that the slats are cut in and how they would operate when the flaps were down would at least give you that reduced to speed effect. We can also see just how the rear of the canopy comes off and how it's situated. or at least how it's built and what it looks like. Additionally, we can see these are ripped from War Thunder, a game I wouldn't really suggest to people because it's a horrible time sink. Um, but my feelings for the game aside, um, I don't know where they got any of their photographic documentation, which sucks because I really wish I knew where they got the various photos or diagrams for these munitions. Um, One, because it's interesting, and I think that sort of information should be shared. But two, well, two, because these are very deceptive. These might look like bombs, but these are actually rockets. It's hard to tell, but the way that these cones are shaped, how they funnel backwards, and their purpose, if you search for these online, is that these would be rocket propelled. Um, Now, with regards to the Type 5 number 6, or at least presumed Type 5 number 6, as I'm not 100% sure if it's actually the case, we can see it's got a sleeve on the front that kind of makes it look stubbier. And that's actually an anti deflection device. And basically, how it works is that when impacting on the water, it doesn't deviate as much and is able to hit its target. There's a couple other uses, or at least that are at least one other use that's good, which is that, well, if the Q1W1 or Q1W is supposed to attack submarines, they have a very curved um, profile, really. So hitting them with a fuse dead on isn't always exactly the easiest thing to do. And having a more blunt face just prevents it, um, even if minutely, it prevents it from completely ricocheting off of your target or bouncing off, even if it's going to blow up. It doesn't maximize its effect. And that sort of sleeve, or in German nomenclature, they call it a Kopfring. It's a little bit different. Like the Kopfring would be like an extra small plate attached just to add circumference to the nose. But the point remains that it's basically just there to maximize any sort of impact it can get on its target. And thirdly, I really wish I knew what their sources were on this because I have a blog on munitions, and well, I mean, I need to know. But that's neither here nor there. Um, Getting back to the plane itself, sadly, I can't find any source for the oblique 20 millimeter cannons, so that will remain a mystery, an unproven mystery for me. And here we just see a very nice stylized photo or drawing, again with the how the array, the radars would be on the rear fuselage, and how the front portion would look like. And I know it's a shorter episode today, but it's mainly because, well, there's only oh so much you can talk about the Tokai. It's not quite as popular as, say, the SB2C, um, or even the Fairy Fulmar. That being said, I have to really give a shout out to the first two websites here. Um, Without these, I wouldn't really have any photos on Japanese radars just because my books haven't come in. And uh, I can only really shout out to any English speakers. Um, Rene Francion's Japanese Aircraft of the Pacific War. It gives a really good summary of Japan's capabilities for aircraft production in World War II, and just has really good overviews on all the various aircraft that you could expect to see from that nation. All the other books that I have are basically all Japanese only. So if I mistranslated anything, I will attribute it to my own faults, rather than Google Translate's um, possible effectiveness. Uh, and as always, please drop me a line on Twitter if you're on there. Feel free to suggest future episodes or what you think should be talked about or discussed. And Patreon, if you want to toss us a couple bucks, it'd always be appreciated. At some point, we will probably get some either Q&As or bonus episodes talking about um, maybe just like bunching up certain groups of aircraft or prototypes and so on and so forth. Anyways, as always, I'm your host, Mr. O. Mr. X could not be with me today. Hopefully, he'll be around for the next episode. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.